Okay, good afternoon. My name is Nader Hashemi. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at the Joseph Corbell School. And on behalf of our center, I'd like to welcome everyone to our final event, both of this academic quarter and of this academic year. Part of the mission of our Center for Middle East Studies is to provide a forum for discussion, debate, and analysis on the contemporary politics and societies of the Middle East and the larger Islamic world. And doing so has never been more urgent given the chaos and turmoil that has engulfed the region in recent years, leading to considerable global concern and apprehension about the future of the region and where it's headed and what it means for us here in the United States. Now, while most of the recent media attention and foreign policy discussion has centered around, understandably, the rise and expansion of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, the nuclear deal with Iran, and more recently, the conflict in Yemen, one of the most important countries in the region has fallen off the radar screens after the tumultuous events approximately 4 years ago related to the Arab Spring. Of course, I'm referring to Egypt, the largest and arguably the most influential and important country in the Arab Islamic world. Egypt is back again in the news, and unfortunately not in a very positive way. Rarely do we have the opportunity to host a guest speaker whose personal history and in many ways his life story is subject to global concern, debate, who's written about in New York Times editorials just days before they arrive here at the University of Denver. This is somewhat of a unique and sort of extraordinary opportunity. And of course, I'm referring to the case of the man sitting next to me, Emad Shahin, our newest Carnegie Centennial Visiting Scholar, one of Egypt's leading political scientists, and also someone, if you're following the news, who was sentenced to death a few days ago by an Egyptian court, along with former Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi and more than 100 other people. Today we are here to discuss what has been happening in Egypt, to discuss both the mass death sentence, what has been taking place in the country since the coup d'etat of July 2013, where is the country headed, why does it matter for the United States and the rest of the world. The format will be that of a public conversation between myself and Professor Shahin, followed by a question and answer session with the audience. In terms of his formal CV or resume, Emad Shahin is on leave from his position as a professor of public policy at the American University of Cairo, and he's currently living in exile in Washington, D.C., where he's a visiting professor of political science at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and a visiting professor with Georgetown's Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. He's the author of Political Ascent, Contemporary Islamic Movements in North Africa, the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam and Politics, co-author with Nathan Brown of The Struggle Over Democracy in the Middle East and North Africa, and with John Esposito, the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Islam and Politics. Previously, Professor Shahin has held important positions at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He was a Henry R. Luce Associate Professor of Religion, Conflict, and Peace Building at the University of Notre Dame, and was also a visiting professor of government in the Department of Government at Harvard University. It's a huge honor to have him with us today. He's taken a break from a very busy schedule of media interviews. Perhaps you heard him on NPR this morning. He's been writing op-eds. Rumor has it that he might be on CNN next week with Christian Amanpour. There's a lot to talk about, but I guess the first order of business is to ask everyone in the audience to please join me in welcoming Emad Shahin to the University of Denver. Emad, let's begin with some background to the mass death sentence. I'm assuming not everyone is up to speed on what is happening. Can you give us the relevant background and context to recent events in Egypt related to the mass death sentences? I mean, in the media reports, these are related to two cases known as the Grand Espionage case and the Prison Break case. What are these cases about, and how is your name implicated in the people who were sentenced in this mass death sentence?
Sure. Just let me say that first, thank you so much for a generous introduction. I'm immensely honored to be back at the Corbell School. and I'm also grateful for your invitation to include me as part of the Carnegie Centennial Program. It's really an immense opportunity for me, and I'm thankful for your generosity and for thinking at least about me during these harsh times. The case and similar other cases start early on, 2 years ago, specifically 2 years ago, after the removal of or a military coup against the first democratically elected president, President Mohamed Morsi, in July 2013. Since then, I think Egypt started to witness what one could term as a reign of terror, or a fascist-like system or state, where the military general started to squash or quell any kind of opposition or any kind of dissent through different means. One, of course, was direct use of force against peaceful protesters, as we have seen, for example, in the massacres of Rab'a and Nahda and other places, which some human rights organizations, of course, denounced and labeled as the largest massacres in the modern history of Egypt. Over the past 2 years, the record is very bleak. We have over 2,000 dead, at least 16,000 injured, and 40,000 languishing in Egyptian jails. The cycle of violence and repression started to go beyond direct opponents to the regime, like the Islamists or specific targets, now to include some icons of the Egyptian revolution of January 25th, 2011. You have names like, for example, Ahmed Maher, Abdel-Fattah, Mahinur al-Masri, and others. These are all secular, liberal, young protesters that at some point played a crucial role in the Egyptian revolution, and also manifested the aspiration of a whole generation for a new Egypt, democratic, free, where everyone can enjoy their dignity and their freedom. So this was one means of squashing opposition, direct use of force. The other means was the use, or has been the use of the judicial system as part of, or as a tool to settle accounts with political opponents and dissidents. And this exactly touches on your question. We now have, unfortunately, highly politicized judicial system that starts to file and arrange cases or put charges against political dissidents and opponents on the basis of very flimsy and unsubstantiated evidence, mainly fabricated cases, like the case that you were referring, or the two cases that you were referring to. My case, and I have to stress this, it's not about me. It's about, like hundreds others who have been sentenced to death in really kind of, sham trials. So in our case, the charges, or in my case, the charges are grand espionage, which specifically, I don't know what that refers to, because, when I was young, I used to know spies. But grand espionage of what, with whom, and so on. No specified charges, like, throughout the case. If you look at the papers, for example, the papers of the case, there isn't any reference, for example, to something that I specifically did on a specific date, action, and so on. All what they have as evidence, and I don't want really to go into evidence, is, as a political scientist, I provided an assessment early on, after the revolution, immediately after the January Revolution of 2011, of the political situation. There was a crisis at that time between the SCAF, what we call the SCAF, the Supreme Council for Armed Forces, and the political forces in the country. So I provided some kind of an assessment of how to get out of this crisis. The memo stressed peaceful means, adherence to peacefulness, and rejection of any violence. This is a position which is still maintained until now, and I still insist on until now. Also, the memo insisted on not giving or enshrining any privileges to the military establishment, additional privileges to the military establishment in any new constitution. And I think this was and of course to side with the demands of the revolution and with the youth, and to continue with that. until we build a democratic country and so on. And I think that's what got the military authorities upset with me early on, that I was very vocal from day one, and I warned against any kind of direct military rule of the country. I always looked at the past 3 or 4 years as, especially the first 2 years, from 2011 to 2013, as an opportunity, historical opportunity for Egypt to start building a democratic society and a democratic process. I know this process suffered from a lot of problems. It was a very rough transition. Many sides got involved and many sides made mistakes. But to me, and until now, and I still insist on that position, a weak democracy, a flawed democratic process is much better than an authoritarian system and dictatorship.
Getting back to the verdict or the death sentence, one of the things that struck me when I was reading the reports is just how incoherent and confused the Egyptian judiciary seems to be with this mass death sentence, because 2 of the people who were condemned are dead.
Yes.
Yes. One of them is in an Israeli jail, so he
Right.
couldn't be charged with the
Yes.
crime that they
Yes.
claimed he committed. Who's in charge in Egypt? I mean, do they not even have the simple competency before they issue the death sentence to see whether these people are alive or dead? It
Yes.
suggests some deep insecurity
Yes.
or confusion at the senior levels of the regime, that it's like one person just wrote a list of names and gave it to the judge to
Right.
read.
Right. I think there are several messages that we can read behind this. And you are absolutely right. There is a lot of inefficiency, incompetence, and a lot of cynicism. Like, for example, when the judge's attention was drawn to the fact that 2 were dead, already dead, actually 3. And one had been or has been in Israeli jails for the past 19 years. So there is no way he could have committed that crime. His response was, "That is not my business." Yes, he said, yes, and he said they did not come up to show that they are dead. Yes, verbatim. So he was expecting the dead to show up in court to prove that they were dead. So it's incompetence, but I think there is a bigger message, and I can at least point to 3 clear messages. One, of course, is to the Egyptian people, that it will become extremely risky to stage any kind of opposition, political opposition, even peaceful one, even to express your opinion or your dissatisfaction about this regime, in writing or vocal. And that can amount to the death sentence, and also to sham trials. So you will not get your day in the courts, or you are not going to be served with really proper justice and due process. That's a clear message, cowing in an entire population. The second message, of course, is to use all these mass death sentences as a bargaining chip on the part of the regime. That in case, for example, that at some point the regime has to yield to some kind of international pressure, especially coming from NGOs, international NGOs, human rights and Amnesty International and so on. So if it commuted the sentence or commutes the sentence from death sentence to life in prison, so it's a win-win situation for the regime.
Right.
That the regime yielded, cooperated, and should be rewarded. The third and most important message for me, and especially at this junction, is to send a clear message to the West, to test the limits of how far they can go with this regime in acquiescing and in tolerating its atrocities, mass violations of human rights, and actually in rewarding it. Because this is actually a pattern that we have seen lately. Since this coup in July 2013, for example, the United States refused to call this coup a coup, which was, of course, a major and a clear message to that regime that we are tolerating you, we are accommodating what you could be doing. The second message, of course, which paid some kind of reward, was, of course, the decision of President Obama recently to lift the arms embargo or the arms freeze on this military Egyptian regime, and I hate to be exaggerating, and to accept to fund repression, to arm repression. It's a repressive regime, and I think it should not have been rewarded this way. So this is a message. They are trying to see how far the West can go and can accommodate them.
The U.S. State Department after you were issued this death sentence, responded by expressing, quote, deep regret, or deep concern over what was happening. And I found that statement to be quite a tepid understatement of what was actually happening. Now, there was no outright condemnation. There was no attempt to sort of send a much stronger message. And all of this sort of speaks to the point that you were just alluding to, U.S. policy under President Obama toward Egypt. There seems to be a very sort of subtle but very solid embrace of this military regime. And all of this is going to have consequences,
Right.
deep consequences for U.S. national security,
Yes.
for the future of the region. Could you speak about
Sure.
how you see this playing out, what the consequences are going to be for the region, for the United States, for the world as a result of this embrace of the military regime?
Look, I mean, the U.S. and the Europeans for long, this has been a pattern. In face, for example, of really massive human rights violations and really kind of absurd sentences, mass death sentences, and there's this kind of sham trials and so on. They express concern. In my view, concern is not enough. They should actually translate that concern into outright condemnation. Outright condemnation, and that still is not enough. You need also to translate that into concrete policies. You see, they have always locked themselves, they meaning the United States and the Europeans, into this kind of dilemma. And I believe it's really an artificial dilemma of security versus values. And they have always looked at security and values, democratic values, human rights values, and so on, as mutually exclusive. I don't look at them as mutually exclusive. And the proof, very simple proof, and for a very simple reason. For the past 60 years, the United States has been opting or leaning toward security. When things become a little bit unstable, unpredictable, let's just go for the strong man, right? Mubaraks, Ben Ali's, and so on and so forth. Now, let's see the record of that policy. It brought us Al-Qaeda. It brought us 9/11. It brought us now ISIS. So I think this is a clear testimony and proof that this choice of security at the expense of democracy and human rights has not been working. And there must be a new vision, a new formula that can really, or through which the United States and the Europeans can look to the region and the aspiration of the region. And most importantly, to the demography of the region. This is a very young region, and the future is for the youth, not for the old generations and for the old-fashioned strategies and policies of autocracy and authoritarianism and repression. And the youth are longing for a better life, for democracy, for rule of law, for dignity. To sum this, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot fund repression, you cannot side with autocrats. And the proof for this, again, I'm not saying, just this is my view. But when, for example, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, describes Sisi, General Sisi, who has committed atrocious violations of human rights, when he describes him as restoring democracy in Egypt, this is too much. And this is actually sending a message to the young, especially the disgruntled young, that democracy is futile. Democracy is not the way. Actually, ISIS is the way. ISIS is the answer. Violence is. And this is exactly what we need to avoid. And the new formula, if you allow me, the new formula should be based for stability, for security, should be based on democracy. Democracy brings you security. Tyranny and authoritarianism will bring you violence and will breed violence and will bring you radicalization, because violence begets violence. It's a very simple equation. So this question is about why ISIS? Where does it come from? What are the causes behind ISIS? They are very clear. It's marginalization, it's disintegration, it's failing states in the region, and also it's not paying enough attention to the real causes and to the root causes of all these issues and problems.
So someone in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, I think, would respond to what you just said with the following sort of argument. We would love it if Egypt would become a democracy, but as we've seen during the Arab Spring, democracy is messy, it's chaotic, it's uncertain, the region is falling apart, we need security and stability.
Sure.
That's why we're supporting, we don't like General al-Sisi, but given the options of a messy democratic transition that might lead to God knows where, better to sort of bank on the safety and the security of dictators and generals?
Simple answer. You have done that for the past 60 years, and it hasn't worked. And it's not going to work in the future. One. Second, democracy was not the cause for what's happening in the region, for that chaos. What was the real cause? Or the real cause was the pushback against democracy. All these regional forces and also international forces that did not feel comfortable with those who won elections. And this is a very important point. All these kind of, inaccurate comparisons between the region, Middle Eastern region and Eastern Europe and so on. And many people see a lot of analogies between the two, but I see major differences. In Eastern Europe, the opposition was the good guys that we needed to support. We meaning the international community, needed to support. In the case of the Middle East, the opposition is viewed as the bad guys, the Islamists, that are always able to win elections. And to many policymakers in the West, they view them as unpredictable. They are coming to establish or institute a new model. And that's something that we have to prevent from taking place. So democracy is not the problem. Democracy actually is the solution. The problem is suppressing democracy, suppressing human rights, and suppressing freedom. And thirdly and finally, we all know democracy is risky, not only in the Middle East, but also in the United States. It's unpredictable. We don't know who the next president is. It's unpredictable everywhere. But we have to establish a framework, a system that at least provide the minimum guarantees for an integrative, a functioning, effective system where we can have some kind of good governance, participation, rule of law, transparency, some kind of equality and justice that can help us all to become integrated. Just last point, look at the region now. The region has been set back maybe 60 or 70 or 80 years ago. I always make this analogy between the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire following the World War I, 1919 onward, and nowadays. You have a region that's being disintegrated, new entities are being formed, and it can take any direction. It can take a forward-looking direction or a backward-looking direction. We can really rebuild and reconstitute democratic system and viable nation states with all this mess. Despite all this mess, I'm not losing hope because this is the only way forward. Or we can, plunge into primordial solidarities and very basic, primitive affiliations, tribal, sectarian, ethnic, and we keep fighting each other. Right. Now, the only formula that can integrate all of us, is a democratic system.
Well, speaking of the need for democracy, and speaking about that in the context of Egypt's post-Mubarak democratic transition, since you were there for most of that period, and since that democratic transition went sort of horribly wrong, let me sort of provide you with what I consider to be the dominant, mainstream, sort of Western/liberal interpretation of what happened in Egypt, and you tell me where that assessment or general view is either correct or incorrect. The dominant view is that Mubarak was toppled, you had a series of elections, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, and then they started to implement an Islamist, autocratic regime that was repressing minorities, that was imposing Sharia, that was alienating a lot of Egyptians. And then a year later, Egyptians came into the street, fearful of Islamist rule, upset at the incompetence of the Morsi regime, and that's when the military stepped in, crushed the democratic process, and they continue in power to today. What's wrong with that narrative?
Inaccurate and not incomplete for a number of reasons. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood made mistakes, and I can list all these mistakes, but and we can write books about the mistakes of a nascent, embryonic democratic force or a force that's coming to start establishing a democratic process and so on. But everybody did make mistakes, not on equal sizes and levels and so on, but everybody, because this is a very complex issue. And it can't be, the blame of, or we cannot put the blame only on one side. It has to be different sides, especially that, you are facing a deep, deep state, as old as, 1,000 years old.
What do you mean exactly by the deep state? I mean, we know what that means in political science terms, but I think
it's
the
not
audience
yes, it's not a static entity, but we are talking about, for example, now, because it keeps changing, but we're talking about state security forces, mukhabarat, intelligence, military and civilian or whatever. We're talking also about the judiciary as part of that deep state. We're talking about the media, and also we're talking about a bunch of intelligentsia that are serving that state. So we are talking about a counter force inside that's resisting change, like a revolution and counter-revolution. And I think to a large extent, the Muslim Brotherhood tried, and this is the main strategic mistake, or two main strategic mistakes. They could not understand the nature or dynamics that you asked about, the nature and dynamics of that state and how to deal with it. They are reformists by nature and wanted to compromise with that state. The state devoured them. That state devoured them. They pushed back, destabilized everything for them. They were instead, and the second mistake, of course, that in order to counterbalance this or to counterforce this strategy, they had to side with the revolutionaries, with the revolution and with the street, which they did not do because they were not revolutionary enough. This is exactly the essence. The essence of the problem in Egypt, just to reiterate and highlight this, is not actually between the Muslim Brotherhood and something else, the military and so on, but it's between military rule and the possible restoration of a democratic rule in Egypt. This is the essence, because it's all about emancipation. It's all about self-determination. All these kind of, like all these movements, it's actually empowering the people themselves, empowering the population in Yemen, in Syria, in Egypt, in Libya, everywhere. And the problem is, in situations like these, and because of this kind of asymmetry between the power of the state and the power of society, we need help. Like we mean the society, civil society needs a lot of help, needs a lot of encouragement, needs a lot of direction and so on. And needs also of a lot of tolerance in terms of trial and error, because we are bound to make mistakes, but we need to have the time to correct these mistakes. The way I see it, for example, and this something has to be mentioned, if you look at the Europeans and the United States, they were extremely tolerant with Mubaraks and Ben Ali's. They were patient with them for 30 years, but they were not patient and were extremely impatient with a democratic process that was rough in Egypt for only 1 year. Look at the amount of financial assistance and aid that was given to Tunisia, which we call now the showcase, and to Egypt during the transition. Actually, most of the international organizations, and the United States included, either froze or maintained the same level of financial assistance without any increase, at a time where actually the economic factor was crucial in pushing this democratization process forward.
Look, I have a dozen other questions, but I want to give a chance to this very patient audience to weigh in and to ask you some questions about what's going on in Egypt and the broader region. So let's turn to the audience. The floor is open. I'd ask you to stand. If you want to identify yourself, please feel free to do so. And then we will give Emad the chance to respond. Go ahead. Yep. Hold on. Take the microphone here. So
Thank you. Well, I was thinking a U.S. State Department official would not put it in these terms. He would not say the choices, or she would not say the choices between democracy and dictatorship, security or democracy. They'd say between more influence and less influence. What would condemning the Egyptian regime achieve? Nothing, I don't think so. Or sanctioning them even.
Yes. So the question is what exactly?
Yeah, what difference is it going to make?
Yes, definitely. Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to argue, that it's not enough to condemn. We have to translate this condemnation into concrete policies. For example, to set a minimum level of tolerance of human rights abuse, that we are not going to take more than accommodate or tolerate mass human rights violations. Identify perpetrators, for example. That's another issue. Show, for example, that you are not rewarding military coups against democratic systems. And there are so many ways by which you can do this. Suspend aid, suspend military supplies. There are so many. Now, like the argument, and I have also to take that into consideration. The argument of State Department official is it's always better to maintain lines of communication with these dictators, because at least if we sever all relationships, we'll not have access to them, right? So therefore, we have to always, communicate, talk to them, and so on. Now, my response to this is not all the times. Sometimes dictators, or in the case of Egypt in particular, where we have the civil-military relations as a very, very complicated issue and matter. I'll explain. Like for example, the military and the ruling general now considers Egypt as an extension of the army and not the other way around. So in this case, we need to give the military in Egypt, military as an establishment, an incentive to reform itself. If we keep appeasing them, they will never reform. If we just tighten the screws a little bit, maybe they will not withdraw completely from political process, but at least they might take 1 or 2 steps backward.
And let's just remind the audience that the United States has an incredible amount of influence over the Egyptian military. $1.2 billion every year goes from this country to the Egyptian military. So the opportunities for influencing Egypt in a proper direction are very easy to sort of identify. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. I was interested in your answer to Nader's question about sort of what was wrong with the liberal view. And I just wondered, a lot of your response was about this deep state, which, we heard reports of police not doing their jobs, and that was one of the failures of the Morsi government. But I just wondered, looking back, whether there were other things that maybe the Morsi government did itself that sort of contributed to the problem, or do you think the deep state was so strong that it was sort of doomed from the start, or were there different things that the Morsi government did?
Right. I will address it at 2 levels. One is the academic theoretical level, which is the problem with the nature of the Egyptian state in particular. So far, for the past maybe 60 years, or even if we can go back as 1805, when we have really a modern, started to have, or 1818, when we started to have really a modern state in Egypt, has been extremely resilient and resistant to any outsiders. So any outsider, and that was the case exactly in 2012, that for the first time in modern Egyptian history, outsiders managed to get elected into the state. And in that case was the Muslim Brotherhood. It could have been someone else. It could have been Muhammad Baradei, for example. It could have been any other secular or democratic candidate. They would have faced the same resistance from that state. Now, that's one thing. Definitely, there were so many steps, as I mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood should have taken or could have taken, and they failed to do so. One, of course, is the issue of insisting, because they tried, but insisting on inclusiveness, insisting on understanding the nature of a democratic transition. It cannot be a majoritarian politics. It cannot be just, 51% would allow you or legitimate you to do whatever you like. That was as one of my friends always say, they were democratically correct, but politically incorrect. And that was actually the essence of the problem. They looked at democracy, or took this kind of democratic procedure very seriously. We got 51%, we can do whatever we like because we have the majority. But this is not the case, or should not be the case, in a democratic transition, and because the other way to look at the 51% is in a divided society. This means that the society is really, really split between two camps. So you have to accommodate as much as you can the other camp, which I think did not happen.
Debbie Avant's question really highlights the criticism that was directed toward the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
Yes, they accepted the procedures of democracy, but on the liberal side of the paradigm, they were not as tolerant, inclusive, open to other voices as they should have been, and that contributed significantly to the demise of the transition period.
This could be, yes, this could be true, but at the same, because I have, I have to take all the sides. The liberals, for example, or the opposition, let's say their opposition, were actually, they always behaved with a coup-like mentality. They always withdrew, they always boycotted, they always, didn't want to cooperate. Now we know in hindsight that many liberal personalities or figures were offered positions by the Muslim Brotherhood, and they declined. So there was this kind of, really polarizing situation that did not allow this, lack of consensus, lack of common ground. I mean, inability of people to compromise, to talk, to trust each other, and that goes, with everyone. I mean, not only one side. And of course, you have, as I mentioned, the third party, which is the deep state, a fourth party, which is the regional powers. Like, I was in Egypt that time, and I kept saying, this is a classical case of destabilization, guys. When you wake up, for example, when you wake up with the news in the newspapers that Egyptian banks have gone bankrupt and you have to go and withdraw your money. That's ABC destabilization in any country, in Latin America, in Africa, and so on. That's exactly what the CIA did, and so on. You go, for example, you wake up that, for example, Egypt has become a failing state, that the state cannot pay salaries in 3 days. That's it. And that's all was not true. So there was, this kind of deliberate effort and to destabilize the whole process. Regional powers, in particular Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, really played and financed, bankrolled this kind of process of causing a counter-revolution in Egypt. And they succeeded, unfortunately.
Mr. Watson. Here, use this.
I was wondering about Mubarak's sentence. I think it was relatively light, like a year or 3, maybe, something like that. But going back to Avant's question about the deep state, and what does his sentencing reveal to us about the larger deep state, perhaps, or anything else, I guess?
Yes. This is very important. It reveals a lot about the nature of judicial system itself, that it is part of this old system, old regime. Like, this is exactly, it touches on so many of the points that we have been trying to raise today. That, for example, whereas the icons of the revolution, those who were aspiring for change and for building a new future, are now languishing in jail, Mubarak and all his assistants and aides have been acquitted, or received very light sentences. I don't know whether Mubarak is serving in jail or not, but I think he's in Maadi Hospital. Yeah. He's in the hospital. Yeah, it's 5-star hospital. Receiving telephone calls, yes. Watching TV, receiving telephone calls, his family are there. And there are rumors even that he gets out of the hospital, in and out. Because who's going to hold anybody accountable for this? So this is the dichotomy that we are seeing. This really touches to the nature of the judicial system and as part of that deep state. Not all of it. There are, of course, some honorable judges still, but a minority. And I think, now with the appointment of this new judge, Minister of Justice, I think we're even going to expect some kind of more alarming changes. Like yesterday, the media started, or of course the opposition media, put a quote by him. And this is the Minister of Justice, newly appointed Minister of Justice. He was appointed yesterday or the day before yesterday, in which he was quoted saying that we are the masters of this country, of this state, and the rest are slaves. We are going to burn the hearts of anyone who dares to burn an image of a judge, verbatim. So you are talking to a fascist-like Minister of Justice. Elimination, annihilation, the use of burning, the expression of gassing, burning, people alive, and so on. The idea of slavery, back again. This is the newly appointed Minister of Justice.
Habib, I saw your hand up. Go ahead. Could you speak up and let me give you the microphone?
United States is not the only country that provides military assistance or financial assistance to Egypt. There are other countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in general. They're providing billions of dollars as well. I wonder how much of the failure of democracy and the restoration of authoritarianism can be attributed to this Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia that's going on, and whether a solution for the Cold War that's going on can also help the Egyptians to get rid of this regime or, restore democracy.
Excellent question. Of course, there are competing models. There are competing models in the region. And of course, competing regional powers. Iran is one of them. However, one has to stress the fact that the Iranian model, it's a revolution. The Iranian model is a revolution, clerical, theocratic, Islamic. It's totally different from the Arab Spring. Despite the fact that, for example, at the early days of the Arab Spring, Khamenei tried to claim or take credit for the Arab Spring. And he said, I think at some point, that the Arab Spring has been inspired by the Iranian Revolution and so on. And he was rebutted immediately, because this is a totally different issue. Even at technical level, I mean, like, we have seen uprisings, and we can define whether we have seen are truly revolutions or something else, so democratic reform and so on. So this is one thing. There is, of course, but what happened, of course, was a massive wave of people power. Something of the nature of what happened in the 50s and 60s. Pan-Arabism, Arab nationalism. It's something that's really kind of is going to, or was bound to change the entire system. I always claim, and I've written about this, that not only changed the domestic politics of the region, but also the regional configuration of the Middle East, all the regional configuration, even the way we perceive the Middle East. The Arab Spring was bound to change that perception. I will give you an example. If you look how the region is always perceived in terms of powers, in terms of actors, they are always divided as what? Radicals and moderates, right? Or Shia and Sunni, or conservative and progressive, or Republicans or monarchists and so on. For once, we were going to be defined the proper way and in the proper definition. Free states versus autocratic and repressive states. Free states that can associate with universal values of democracy, freedom, and human rights. And that could have really allowed a new, completely new region to arise. And that will change, as just back to your question, all these kind of alliances and regional affiliations. Like, the region would have been now divided along, as I mentioned before, free and democratic, and not free and not democratic. So in this case, countries like Turkey, like Iran, like Egypt, like Tunisia, like maybe others, Syria if succeeded, or Yemen if succeeded, or Bahrain if succeeded, would be members of one camp, the free and democratic states. That's a total reconfiguration of the region. And I think this is, to answer your question, one reason why Saudi Arabia, because you referred to Saudi Arabia named specifically, why Saudi Arabia resisted this change, and why the United Arab Emirates are resisting, and why the United States and the EU are not really caring much about this change, because they still did not figure out whether this is predictable enough to be to their interests or not. So far, we know they are very bureaucratic. I'm talking about the State Department and other. Of course, at the risk of getting angry with me, they are extremely bureaucratic, and they take time to change. So this was really very swift, too quick for them to absorb and to allow to get out of control and out of hand. They gave it 1 year. They gave it only 1 year. And I will always repeat this. And they gave Mubarak 30 years. And that's unfair.
Okay, yeah, Ahmed.
Thank you very much. I have 2 quick notes and 1 question. The first note is, I think the main problem now in Egypt is beyond the politicization of the society, or it's the militarization of everything in Egypt. Yes. And I remember, it's very ironic, because I still remember the debate we had back in 2013, 2012, 2011, to phrase a constitution that doesn't allow a military trial for civilians. But unfortunately now, actually the civilian judicial system looks like the military one. I mean, it's even more worse sometimes. So this is one problem. The second problem, in my point of view, and it's related to this civil-military relations, and I totally agree with you that you can never, in nowadays Egypt, get rid of them all of a sudden. I mean, get rid of them from the political process. And we need years of this.
True.
And this is another challenge we all have, whether Islams, whether liberals, seculars. The main problem and the main challenge, and I think this is shared by the American administration, and also this is a question raised by the general public in Egypt themselves, who are not politicized, who don't care if Muslim president in power or Sisi in power, whoever in power, they just care about stability in their life. Their main question is, given the current situation where Islamists are either jailed or killed, or some of them turn to violence and terrorism, given that ISIS is there, given that the whole region is not stable, and given also that liberals and secular lost their credibilities, and they have shown that they are nothing in the political equation. They are not weighted in any means. So if we stop supporting Sisi, whether the general public or the American administration or whoever, then who would alternate him or the army?
Yes.
Nobody. Then
yes.
we can never leave Egypt to flips like this.
Yes.
We have to support it
Exactly.
anyway. So
Yes.
how would you answer such kind of
Excellent.
question?
Yes, excellent question. The first part, I fully agree with you about the politicization, militarization of society. Yes, I fully agree with you, and about the nature now of the civil judicial system as opposed to the military system. The second part we need really to discuss it because, and I don't mean any kind of offense, but it immediately reminded me of the colonial argument, of the mandate and all this kind of stuff. That you're not ready for democracy. There is no alternative. The British have to take care of you, and the French for 30 years, for 70 years, for 150 years. And societies cannot mature like this. They cannot develop like this when they are disempowered, initially disempowered. This is exactly what Mubarak used to do. I'm not rebutting you. I know, exactly. I'm just, responding, exactly. I'm just responding to that argument. This is exactly what Mubarak did. He built on his legitimacy, on trying to instill in the Egyptian this sense of ineffectiveness. You are nothing. You cannot act against me. And that actually was shown, if you remember, 2010, yes, 2010, after this kind of fake elections, when he said, when the opposition formed a parallel parliament, he said what? Let them have fun. Let them have fun. And like a whole revolution blew up in his face. So this is one thing, this kind of effectiveness. Sisi does the same thing now, but in a different way. Sisi is building or basing his raison d'etre, I don't want to say legitimacy, his raison d'etre on eradicating the Muslim Brotherhood, on eradicating the so-called terrorism and so on, and not allowing any kind of political opening to emerge and so on. So he knows he's part of the problem, and that's how I consider him. If we are seeking some kind of a national reconciliation, which he rejects, which he repeatedly said, there is no national reconciliation, there is no place for the Muslim brothers during my term. He said it very frankly. So if he knows that he's part of the problem, and if he allowed for national reconciliation, that will be his own undoing. Now, the problem is, I live in Washington. I think most of the think tanks in Washington have swallowed this bait, that there is no alternative to Sisi. So we have to, make a modus vivendi with Sisi and so on. I tend to disagree with this completely, because if you keep saying this, you will never have an alternative. What we need now is, there are political elites in Egypt, and there are counter elites in Egypt, and there are civilians in Egypt. And Egyptians, I think, went through very rough experience that now can, and they learned so many lessons. And now they can hope to build, and they are capable of building a broad democratic civil coalition. It might take time, but I always say this, the January 2025 revolution, 2011 revolution, succeeded only when Egyptians started to agree on a list of demands. And they got these demands fulfilled, and they insisted on them until they toppled Mubarak. The future will be successful for Egyptians, or the way forward is for Egyptians to agree on the kind of future that we want to build for this country. And I cannot see any other future except building a democratic system. I know this sounds like rhetoric, but these are not only rhetoric. This is actually an instrumentalist approach. A democratic system, good governance, rule of law, participation, and oversight, popular oversight. That's all what we need to agree on. Build some kind of a common ground of agreed upon values, mega principles that can guide all of us for the future. That will be the alternative to Sisi.
Let's take a couple of more questions at the back, and then let's 2 questions at the back.
Of course, the deep state will always be a significant obstacle to possibilities of democratic transition in Egypt. But do you see processes of learning among political elites, both Islamist and secular, both from the failed previous example in Egypt and the success in Tunisia of the need for dialogue and compromise and accommodation? Do you see this currently at play?
There is a lot of mistrust, unfortunately, between the different political forces. And all attempts so that's like the pessimistic fact, but the optimistic fact that there is exactly what you are talking about. There is a realization that we have to get together. It might be too soon, might be too early, but there have been so many calls for dialogue, sitting at the same table together, expressing concerns, expressing fears, exposing ourselves and our concerns to each other. And I have been part of this, several of these attempts outside, abroad. And they usually get sabotaged by, like very trivial issues that are still anchored in this deep mistrust between the different civil forces and political figures and so on. But one characteristic of the 2011 revolution was this idea of what we can call collective mind and collective way of thinking. So many times that one person would think about an idea, and you'll find that at the meeting, 2 or 3 had already thought about the same idea and are coming to propose it, honestly, without exaggeration, and to really a surprising level. This, I think, we are reaching that stage when everybody says there is a need for reconciliation. Outside, not inside. Inside, the Egyptian population has been exposed to massive media machine that is always instilling polarization, escalation, violence, elimination, and all the fascist symptoms that you can see. This cult of personality, Sisi is Messiah, Sisi is Redeemer, he's the savior of the country, and so on. People, and he's the hope for Egypt. And if you look at his record so far, he hasn't achieved that much, by the way, with all the advantage that he has to his side. The other thing, of course, is this, as I mentioned, this idea of polarization and this sense of insecurity. Like there is a division in the population. There are 2 populations and so on. Anyway, so yes, dialogue is very necessary. And I think, this is exactly the direction that we should be focusing on. To build some kind of common ground, to agree on at least one goal and one objective, and then take it from there. And the objective should be restoration of democratic life and civilian control over the political process.
Last question at the back.
So I actually had 2 questions, but I'll keep them brief, and they kind of fit into each other. The first one I was going to say is, I know that there is kind of a tendency to paint that, I really dislike the word Islamist because it doesn't really mean anything at the end of the day.
It's commonly used, so it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
But there's kind of the tendency to say that Islamists, they're not progressive, or because there are some that they are not progressive at all, and there are some that are very progressive.
Very good.
What were the tendencies from specifically, I want to say the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan in Egypt, and how did they fit into any sort of progressive paradigm? And because the narrative is that they were so against the whole society and everything.
Right.
And the second part of that I was going to say is, how can we? Me and my family were from Syria. We left 2 years before revolution started. How can we? And we've seen it go on for 4 different years now. How can we ensure that this mistake, the counter-revolution, does not happen after? Because that's what I was just talking about with my family the other day. What if it happens in Syria? We shed all this blood, this genocide for nothing, for a military regime to take over again.
Excellent questions. As you alluded, there are the phenomenon of political Islamism is not a monolithic one. It's very diverse. And as Mahmoud Ayoub, of course, in his excellent book mentioned, there are many faces of political Islam. So to be specific, and for this interest of time, the Muslim Brotherhood are viewed as mainstream Islamic movement. The issue is here, when they came to power, was the inability to really come to the essence of the problem and identify what the problem was. The problem was not about Islam in Egypt. The problem actually was not, even though it was portrayed as such, was not about identity in Egypt. The main problem was democracy. And I know I keep repeating this, and many of the people think, that I'm just, different planet and so on, and democracy is the solution. No, democracy is not the solution for everything, but democracy has a lot of things to offer, especially in particular situations and critical situations like this. So that was actually the essence of the whole problem: democracy, freedom, empowerment of the population itself, vis-a-vis the forces of counter-revolution that you see it, be it the military establishment, be it the state security, be it, even the bureaucracy. Egypt has 7 million bureaucrats, 7 million civil servants, largest than any political party, and 6 million members of the Sufi orders, combine, maybe they overlap, but you have a massive part of the population that's extremely static, pro-status quo, doesn't like change, and you have to take that into consideration, that state as agencies and so on. So I think this was one of the major, or the essence of the problems themselves. Inability to identify what was the core issue, what was at stake here. Was it Islam, was it identity, or was it democracy, and we can go from there. Your second question, how can we prevent a counter-revolution from happening? It's an extremely difficult question, by the way. Very, very difficult question. And it has to be taken case by case and country by country. For me, and this is, again, it will sound very idealistic, integration, inclusiveness, integration. I'm deliberately repeating this because I have to always remind myself. You have to integrate as many social forces, political forces, other forces into some kind of a dynamic process, they all have sense of ownership. That actually undermines the tendency of counter-revolutionary elements try to make a comeback. We have seen this in Egypt for the first at least 18 months or 2 years after the revolution. And that's exactly what becomes at some point a decisive factor. When you build some kind of symmetry in the power between the state and society and the state. And when the state feels that society always can push back and can always, occupy more space and more space. I know I'm not being very specific, but it's integration, it's trying to rebalance, trying to redraw the balance of power between the state and society. That will help a lot.
Okay, we're actually a bit ahead of schedule. We can take actually one more question here at the front.
We talked about other countries in the region. I wanted to hear your opinion about how Israel-Palestine issue comes into play in this whole conflict.
Well, I will speak about Egypt itself and how, for example, this current regime. Yes, that's what I was trying to address. Address it as, with the current regime and so on. I think the current regime is looked favorably by Israel, based on a number of measures and steps that it has taken. One, of course, is the idea of securing all these kind of borders between Egypt and Gaza, the way the Hamas has been treated for the past 2 years, or actually 4 years or 3 years, and not only Hamas and the Palestinians in general, and the Syrians as well. I think the Syrians and the Palestinians in Egypt, as refugees even, are having a very tough time. And of course, by the way this current regime is addressing the issue of tunnels. But at the expense of what? At the expense of extending security, stability, tranquility, and law and order in Sinai, entire Sinai. Also at the expense of huge radicalization of the entire Sinai. And this is local. Most of it is local because the regime likes to portray this as ISIS and coming from outside and so on. It's very simple. It's radicalization, and most of these local groups, many of them are tribal groups that started to be armed and face the regime repression with armed resistance, started to affiliate themselves with ISIS. It's a major, critical, drastic transformation in this conflict. And this is exactly what we are trying to prevent. Because even for a democratic country in the system in the future, an Egyptian democratic, if Sinai gets out of control, and if a military regime could not handle Sinai and armed resistance in an area like Sinai, it's 1/5 of Egypt. It's 20% the size of Egypt, total size of Egypt. So if a democratic system will be in a less position to deal with Sinai. This is one thing. So when it comes to Israel, Israel is considering the current regime and as its own or its ally. There is a lot of, just to mention this, a lot of military expansionism and adventurism at the same time that's taking place. Libya is a good case in point. And that even goes against the decision of the international community in order to find a political solution for Libya. This current regime actually is militarizing and helping militarize the conflict in Libya. And that, of course, will have repercussions not only in Egypt, it will have repercussions on Tunisia, which is a nascent democracy that needs some kind of at least some border security, which is not happening, of course, as a result of the radicalization of the situation in Libya and so on. So there are a lot of, I don't know, miscalculations or at least undesirable policies that are taking place on the part of that regime that actually needs to be addressed very quickly.
Emad, on behalf of our Center for Middle East Studies, on behalf of the Korbel School and the University of Denver, I want to thank you for being here with us at a very difficult time for yourself, for your family, and for your country. Please join me in thanking Emad.
Thank you very much. Thank you.